They thought he was just another old man, sitting where he didn't belong, loitering on a porch time had already forgotten. But the truth, that porch remembered him more than any courtroom ever would. Every chipped board, every rusted nail, they whispered his name, because once, long ago, he built this house with his own hands, and the city trying to evict him, it used to call him a hero. This is not a story about trespassing. It's a story about memory, about dignity, and what happens when a man who's lost everything refuses to lose himself. Harold Elridge had a routine. Every morning, before the world had time to remember him or forget him again, he would walk 3 blocks down Willow Street, turn the corner past the old general store that now sold vape pens and lottery tickets, and stop in front of a house that didn't belong to him anymore, at least not on paper. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, like it had been holding its breath for too long. The paint had surrendered to the sun decades ago, leaving behind a memory of white, now turned soft gray. To passers-by, it was just another condemned house. To Harold, it was the last honest witness of his life. He would sit down, slowly, always carefully, on the 3rd step, the one that still creaked the same way it did in 1974. That creak, it greeted him like an old friend. It was the kind of welcome he didn't get anywhere else anymore. And so he sat, not for hours, not out of stubbornness, just long enough to remember. Some mornings he'd whisper his wife's name, Clara, not loud enough for anyone to hear, just enough for the porch to understand. He'd glance toward the upstairs window, where sunlight once spilled across the crib of a baby boy who never made it past his 2nd spring, and he'd close his eyes, because memory doesn't ask for permission. It simply shows up. Neighbors walked by without looking. The new ones, anyway. The ones who came after the tech company bought out half the street. They didn't know the man who once laid the concrete for their sidewalks, who reinforced the beams in their basements, who fought overseas so they could ignore him in peace. And that was okay. Harold never needed them to know. The porch knew. The walls knew. The creak in that 3rd step, it remembered everything. But the city didn't remember. And when you're no longer in their system, you're not just forgotten, you become a problem to remove. So on a Tuesday morning in early October, a white car with government plates pulled up. 2 men step out, ties loose, clipboards tight. "Mr. Elridge," one of them asked, already knowing the answer. "You've been warned before. This is city property now. You can't be here." Harold didn't stand up right away. He looked at the man's shoes, polished but new, shoes that had never bent down to pour concrete or carry bricks, shoes that hadn't marched through the dust of old wars. Then he looked past them, to the porch, to the cracked window, to the space where Clara once planted rose bushes, and finally he stood, straightened his collar, picked up his worn fedora from the step, and nodded. He didn't speak, because some things are too tired for words. The men led him away, clipboard trailing behind. To them, it was just another successful eviction. To Harold, it was a betrayal signed in silence. But he didn't fight back. Not yet. There was a time when Harold Elridge was not just respected. He was essential. He was the man people called when a foundation cracked, when steel beams bent under pressure, when bridges needed to stretch across rivers no one believed could be crossed. He was an engineer, one of the few black engineers in the city back in the 1960s, and he didn't get there by luck. He got there by outworking, outlasting, and outthinking every barrier laid before him. He was the son of a janitor and a church seamstress, grew up in a neighborhood where no one fixed things, they patched them. But Harold saw more than patches. He saw structure. He saw strength. He saw blueprints where others saw brokenness. By 23, he had designed his first civic building. By 30, he was leading public works projects all over the state. And at 35, he built a house on Willow Street. His name wasn't just on the blueprint. It was in every nail, every beam, every floorboard. That house was more than shelter. It was legacy. It was love. He built it for Clara, his wife, with a soft laugh and a sharper mind. Together they planted the front garden. Together they sang to their son in the nursery. And when the fever came and took their boy in a matter of days, together they fell apart. Clara never really recovered. She stopped singing, stopped planting, and one night just after their 16th anniversary, she left quietly, gracefully, like the closing of a book without a final chapter. Harold stayed because someone had to remember. He stopped working city contracts not long after, refused the job offers, refused the awards. He built things that lasted, but the thing that mattered most had already broken, and the city, as cities often do, forgot him. When zoning changed and taxes rose, they sent letters, then warnings, then men in suits with blank eyes and legal smiles. They told him the house had to go, that it wasn't safe and fit, irrelevant, but they didn't see the blueprint. They didn't see the story, because they had never needed to, and so they filed their papers, stamped their orders, called it progress. But Harold called it something else. He called it erasure. The courtroom was cold, not just in temperature, but in the way it made you feel small, forgettable, like the room had been designed to remind you that power didn't live in people. It lived in paperwork. Harold sat alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no family, just his old coat, his weathered hat, and a silence that had learned how to survive long before this room ever existed. The judge barely looked up. He had that kind of face, the kind that had long ago stopped seeing individuals. Only case numbers, only schedules, only problems to push off his docket. "Mr. Elridge," he said flatly, "you understand why you're here?" Harold nodded. "I believe so." The judge smirked. "Then let's make this quick." And just like that, the story of Harold Elridge, engineer, veteran, father, builder, was reduced to a line on a file. Trespassing on condemned property. They read off city codes, safety violations, zoning laws. They spoke as if paper mattered more than people. When the judge finally asked him, "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Harold didn't speak right away. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had poured the foundation for half the schools in that district, the same hands that had held his son while fever took him, the same hands that had placed a ring on Clara's finger, built homes, held blueprints, buried memories, and then, softly, he said, "I was sitting on the porch. That's all." The courtroom chuckled. Even the judge let out a breath that sounded too much like a laugh. "On the porch of a condemned house?" he asked. Harold met his eyes, calm, clear, steady. "It's the last place that remembers me," he said. "The last place I remember belonging." No one laughed after that. The judge shifted in his seat. His face tightened. Sentiment has no place in a court of law. But the silence in the room told a different story. Because for a moment, just a brief breathless moment. Everyone in that room saw what Harold saw, not an old man on a broken porch, but a man clinging to the last thread of who he once was. The judge tried to regain control. He raised his voice. "You were warned. You chose to ignore the law." Harold nodded. "I did." "And why?" the judge snapped. Harold paused, then answered, barely above a whisper, "Because memory isn't something you can evict." And with those words, he stopped being a defendant. He became a mirror, showing the courtroom everything they had tried not to see. The sentence was simple: 30 days, county jail, effective immediately. The gavel fell like a stone, final, indifferent, the kind of sound that says, "We're done here." Harold didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't even blink. He reached for his hat, stood with the same quiet dignity he had carried into the room, and waited for the officer to escort him out. The bailiff hesitated just a second too long, because even he felt something wasn't right. That kind of silence, the kind that settles on a room when shame walks in, hung thick in the air. The judge straightened his robe, already reaching for the next case file, eager to move on, to forget. But Harold wasn't quite finished. He turned to the bench, voice soft but steady. "Your Honor, may I make one request?" The judge didn't even look up. "Depends. What is it?" Harold replied. "Just a phone call." A pause, then a scoff. "You should have thought of that earlier," the judge muttered, clearly done with the day, and with him. But Harold waited, still, calm, as if the whole room hadn't already decided his worth. The bailiff, after a moment, offered his department-issued phone. Harold took it gently, with care, like he was holding something more than plastic and metal, something sacred. No contact list, no hesitation. He dialed from memory. One ring, two, then a quiet click, and Harold said for words, not loud, not rushed, but with the weight of a man who had carried silence for far too long, "It's time. Bring them." Then he hung up. No explanation, no follow-up. He handed the phone back, folded his hands once again, and said nothing more. But everything had changed, because in those four words, Harold had shifted the ground beneath them all. It started with footsteps, not loud, not rushed, but deliberate, measured, heels clicking against marble like punctuation marks in a sentence no one was ready to read. Click, click, click. The courtroom turned, almost as one, not out of curiosity, but instinct, because something was coming, something different. Then the doors opened, not with a bang, but with purpose, and there she was, Naomi Elridge, Harold's daughter, a woman no one in that room had expected, but none of them would ever forget. She didn't just walk in. She arrived, tall, composed, clad in a black suit tailored so sharp it looked like it could cut silence, a briefcase in one hand, resolve in the other. 3 younger attorneys followed behind her, but no one saw them. All eyes were on Naomi, because Naomi wasn't just someone's daughter. She was a name. A Harvard-trained constitutional lawyer, a civil rights advocate who had stood before Congress and left senators speechless, a woman who had rewritten parts of housing law after her own mother lost their first home, and now she was standing in a courtroom that had just tried to erase her father. The judge cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this proceeding is over," he said, but his voice cracked just a little. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't need permission. She walked straight down the aisle, past every rustling notebook, every stiff collar, past every silent shame in that room, and stopped next to Harold. She touched his shoulder gently, like grounding a man who had held up the sky for too long. Then she turned, looked the judge in the eye. Her voice rang out not loud, but undeniable. Your Honor, before you proceed further, there are documents you need to see. She opened her briefcase, placed a thick folder onto the bench, and with it, the weight of every truth that had been ignored for far too long. And in that moment, the courtroom belonged to her, not the judge, not the law, not the system, her, and justice was finally listening. The judge hesitated. His hand hovered above the file, fingers twitching like they already knew. Whatever was inside would not be easy to ignore. Around the courtroom, a hush fell. No one whispered, no one moved, because they all sensed it. The story was shifting. He opened the folder. The first page was enough. A certified deed, dated and signed decades ago. The name in bold lettering, Harold M. Elridge. The judge blinked. His face twitched. He turned the page. More documents followed. A transfer of ownership never completed by the city. A zoning appeal buried in backlog, left unresolved. Letters, signatures, stamps. Evidence that the house wasn't just legally his, it had never stopped being his. Then came the rest. Newspaper clippings, awards for engineering excellence, photos of Harold beside bridges and buildings still standing, military service documents, letters from state officials, one handwritten note from the governor himself. Each sheet was a verdict in its own right. Not guilty, not invisible, not disposable. The judge swallowed, tried to compose his face, tried to control a courtroom that no longer belonged to him. Naomi stood firm. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Harold remained silent, but his silence was no longer defense. It was declaration, and slowly, one by one, the people in the room began to shift. The bailiff stepped back. The prosecutor set her pen down. Even the court clerk stopped typing, because they saw it now. This wasn't justice being served. This was justice catching up. The judge cleared his throat softly. Ms. Elridge, this information, it changes things. Naomi gave a single nod, but Harold said nothing, because the truth had finally spoken, loud enough for everyone to hear. The judge sat still, papers neatly stacked, gavel within reach. But for once, he didn't know what to say. The courtroom remained silent. No objections, no whispers, just the sound of one truth, taking up more space than any law ever could. He cleared his throat twice, then finally spoke. In light of the evidence presented, this court vacates the sentence. All charges against Mr. Elridge are hereby dismissed. The words echoed, flat, unceremonious, but they fell into the room like warm water on frost. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of victory. It was quiet, earned, heavy with everything that had almost been lost. The bailiff stepped back from Harold, no longer the man with handcuffs, now simply a witness. The prosecutor looked down, her pen untouched since Naomi entered. Even the clerk wiped at her eye discreetly before returning to her keyboard. And Harold, he stood, slowly, straight, not triumphant, just present, fully, finally seen. The judge avoided his gaze. That alone spoke volumes. Naomi placed a hand on her father's arm, a silent, sacred gesture, as if to say, we're done here. But Harold didn't leave right away. He turned, looked at the room, not to shame it, but to mark it as a place where forgetting had tried to win and failed. Then, quietly. They walked out, and the doors behind them closed, not with a bang, but with a breath. The doors closed behind them, but it wasn't the end, because some endings don't come with applause. They come with a long, steady walk back into the world. Harold stepped onto the courthouse steps. His feet met the stone like he had been there before, like he had helped lay them. In a way, he had. Reporters were there, cameras, microphones, the kind of crowd that usually showed up for scandal or spectacle. But Harold walked past them, not ignoring, just moving forward. Naomi stayed by his side, not guiding him, just walking with him, because this wasn't a victory march. It was something gentler, something harder, a return. Every step was quiet, but it said everything. People on the sidewalk paused, not because someone told them to, but because they felt it. Something about the way he carried himself, not proud, not defiant, just honest. He didn't wave, didn't speak, but somehow they understood. By the time he reached the bottom of the stairs, someone had taken off their hat, then another, and another, not as a trend, not for attention, but for respect. No cheers, just stillness, as if the city itself was remembering and regretting, and for a moment hoping to be better. Harold paused at the curb, looked down the street where he used to walk with Clara, where his son used to chase after autumn leaves, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled, just a little, not for them, not even for justice, but for memory, the kind no eviction notice could touch. And then he walked home. Weeks passed. The story faded from headlines. The cameras moved on. The court clerk went back to typing without pause. The judge continued his docket. The world resumed. But something remained, because sometimes legacy doesn't scream. It settles in the spaces between steps, in the way silence feels heavier now, in the shift of shoulders when someone mentions Harold's name. The house on Willow Street is still there. It hasn't been demolished. It hasn't been sold. It hasn't been touched. But something is different. People slow down when they pass it now. Some even stop, not to trespass, not to take pictures, just to remember. A city inspector once came by, looked up at the porch, and without a word, turned around. No forms filed, no warnings posted, because that porch doesn't just belong to Harold anymore. It belongs to a story that asked the city one simple question. Do you remember who built you? Naomi still visits, not often, just when the air feels like her mother's perfume, or when the sun hits the porch just right. She doesn't bring flowers. She brings a book, sits, reads a few pages, then leaves the book behind open, like her father taught her. Some stories don't need to be closed, and Harold, he never asked for a statue, never wanted his name on a building. He just wanted the place he built to remember he was here. And it always will. We don't always remember the builders. We remember the buildings, the bridges, the monuments, but not the hands that poured the concrete, not the eyes that stayed up at night calculating weight, not the hearts that cracked before the walls did. Harold Elridge was one of those hearts. And for a while, his name almost disappeared, but memory has a way of surviving, not in statues, not in history books, but in the way people pause, in the way silence stretches just a little longer, in the way a porch becomes more than wood. Because Harold didn't fight to be remembered as a hero. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand headlines. He simply stood, and in doing so, he reminded us all that dignity doesn't need permission. It just needs patience and presence. So the next time you walk past an old house or hear a story that feels too quiet to matter, stop, listen, look again, because somewhere beneath the dust and silence, there may be a herald, not asking to be seen, but reminding us what happens when we finally do.